So, hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Um, in our interviews, as you probably know, we talk mostly with people involved in prison work or somebody that's involved with the criminal justice system here in the United States. And we focus a lot of our interviews on character transformation because that's really at the heart of our work. And tonight, we're talking with Libby Hoffman, a former political science professor at Principia College, and she's now the president of Catalyst for Peace, an organization that has spent about, 15 years doing amazing transformational work with people in the African nation of Sierra Leone. And you no doubt remember that Sierra Leone experienced a horrific and bloody civil war. The post-war reconciliation work that Libby's organization does focuses on helping communities in Sierra Leone find it in their hearts to offer forgiveness to their neighbors after brutally killing each other. How do you bring about transformation of the heart in order to live peaceably with your neighbors again? And if this task wasn't monumental enough, Libby is the author of the book, The Answers Are There, as well as being a film producer. So Libby is fairly busy, I would say. She's right now in Washington, D.C., has a conference tomorrow, and hope that goes well for you, Libby. And first of all, I just want to say what an honor it is to have you with us here tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. It really is my pleasure to be here. So I'm grateful.
Oh, thank you. Well, let's just start kind of like at the beginning. If you could just tell us a little bit about your early life and how did you become a political science professor at Principia College? And
Yeah.
why political science?
Why political science? Um, I would say a couple things. When I was in high school, my high school dream for myself was either to be a professional actress or Secretary of State. So Um, yeah, a little. I've always just been drawn internationally, and it's always felt like a calling for me, and was always. I think I always felt drawn out into the world. And for me, when I was in college, it was a question of political science or history, really. And I remember the moment where I thought, I think I want to do political science because I'm really interested in helping things to change. And it feels like political science will equip me more for the work of change. And I think I've just always had that sort of inner activist, and political science felt like the vehicle for that. But yeah, and I don't know that I intended to, when I graduated from college, I ended up moving to Principia because I got married and my husband was coaching at Principia. And then we left for me to go to graduate school in international relations and came back with 1.5 kids. And so I was focused on parenting them and finishing up my graduate work when a teaching position opened up at the college. And it seemed I had done a little bit of teaching when I was at Principia the first time with actually coordinating a student-run class. When I was at Williams College is where I went to as an undergraduate, my favorite class there was actually a student-run class that I took on the theory and practice of nonviolent action. And I love the topic, but I also love the process of it. And so when I had been at Principia the first time, I had tried to put that in place. It started a student-run class that I facilitated while I was doing other things professionally and loved it. And so when I came back this time with a graduate degree and this teaching job opened up, it just seemed like a great fit. So and I loved the fact that I could teach at a place. I've always been a person of deep faith and always felt that my faith shaped sort of the way I looked at the world, and was a student of international relations. And faith and religion at that time was a completely separate thing, even in an academic
Right.
sense, from the way
Right.
international relations was practiced.
Mm-hmm.
I held them together in myself,
Mm-hmm.
but very little in the coursework that I did or the way that I engaged in the thinking and conversations that I was having. And I loved the idea that teaching at Principia opened up a little more opportunity to work to weave those together, at least in the conversations that I was having, and to think about how your spiritual understanding might guide or inform the way you engage in the world, and vice versa, how the world will inform and shape the way you approach your spiritual practice. I loved the chance to have those conversations, and teaching at
Mm-hmm.
Principia really gave a great, platform for that. So
Mm-hmm.
it was a great fit.
How long did you teach?
I taught, oh, I think I taught for 4 years. And so not very long, and more, I guess 3.5, because I did 3 full years and then came back and taught for another
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
half year.
Yeah.
So,
I'll bet you were a really good instructor. I can just feel it. That
well,
would have been a fascinating thing to have a group of young Christian scientists talking about political science.
I loved the teaching part of it, and I loved the engaging students to be thinkers. I mean, to me, like that was the ultimate objective. And I did a lot of service learning work in my classes where we would do projects in the community as a way of engaging the learning in new and different ways. And I was the faculty advisor for the annual public affairs conference that they have there, when I
Mm-hmm.
was there. And I have to say, I always felt like that was one of the best. As much as I prided myself on being a good teacher, I felt like the students learned more from putting on that event than
Yeah.
probably I think anything that they did, because when you give
Mm-hmm.
people responsibility for making
Mm-hmm.
something happen,
Yeah.
you just learn by doing. And I think actually that really
Yeah.
informed my
Yeah.
perspective and my activism and
Yeah.
work in the world after teaching.
Right. That's why I would think you would be a really good teacher, because it's turning people loose on the assignment. How else are you going to learn something
Right,
really? I
right.
mean, there's the theory side, and then there's the let's go do it side.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
So I'm going to jump into the. I have a feeling there's a link here. So
yeah,
tell us about how your organization, Catalyst for Peace, um, first came into being. What
yeah,
caused it to come into being? And then I also want to know, and I think maybe others want to know, is that what role did God and Christian Science play in
yeah.
its formation?
Well, there is an in-between step that I think bears just talking a little bit about, which is, I mentioned that I was the faculty advisor for the public affairs conference, and the first year that I was in that role, the students chose the topic of conflict resolution as the topic for that, and
Mhm.
um, and I taught courses at Principia on negotiation and conflict resolution. And what I found is that there was a really special affinity, that the students loved it. They felt a gravitation towards it.
Mhm.
And at that time, I was writing my dissertation on the topic of mobilizing religious resources for peace. Because if you recall, I was saying in that field, there was very little specific attention to religion. I felt this is a huge wasted resource. And I
Mhm.
thought that some of the best work was happening around the world in faith and interfaith communities. And I wanted to both learn more about it and write more about it and teach more about it. So
Mhm.
that was happening separately. Meanwhile, the students at Principia were really good at
Mhm.
this work and
Mhm.
really interested in it, and were continually turning to their own faith to inform the way they were thinking about and doing the work.
Mhm.
And so we began to ask, as I was through my own research, coming to learn a lot more about the way other faith communities were engaged explicitly and developing their own sort of peace practices. Um,
Mhm.
there was a really strong Jewish presence for peace. I was friends with somebody who was facilitating these conversations within the Methodist community. The Mennonites have been really known for their
Mhm.
contribution to peace building, and
Mhm.
the Quakers.
Mhm.
And so I kind of was looking around going, well, where are the Christian Scientists and where should the Christian Scientists be? And we happened to invite somebody as a speaker for that public affairs conference, Cynthia Sampson, who was a Christian Scientist, and she had been an editor at the Monitor, and she had co-written a book, co-edited a book called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft. And she was helping to start the conflict resolution program at Eastern Mennonite University. So she was well established in the field of peace building and conflict resolution and a Christian Scientist. And I hadn't known her before. We met, the students loved me. We set up a little conversation with just to talk about Christian Science and conflict resolution, Christian Science and peace
Mhm.
building during that public affairs conference. And that began a larger conversation. And Cynthia and I, along with some of the students from Principia, began to sort of help host and participate in some conversations with other Christian Scientists around the world, including at 10 Acre, up at the Asher House in Madison, Wisconsin, and other places. And we found sort of a band of other people really interested in thinking, what is it that we uniquely have to contribute to the field as Christian Scientists? Anyway, the long and the short of it is that led to founding an organization called Peace Discovery Initiatives.
Mhm.
And where we felt the whole field of conflict resolution was defined problem first, even the name conflict resolution. You start with a problem and you analyze the problem, and then you work your way to solutions. We would actually bring a completely different orientation and a much more
Mhm.
positive focus on peace building, looking for what are your visions, what are your dreams, what are your aspirations, where are the things that are good that are happening, how do we identify, mobilize, build on those, and discover
Mhm.
the good that's possible together. And so that was the basis of Peace Discovery Initiative, was to say,
Mhm.
how can we bring the best of our faith tradition into this work more explicitly?
Mhm.
And we did a bunch of work together, and I'm happy to go into any more of that, um, if folks have questions. Developed trainings and hosted conferences and published a book, um, and then at that point, so that was my focus, and I left teaching because I really wanted to go into the practice of this work, and so focused on peace building practice through peace discovery initiatives. And then in 2002, my dad, who was a land developer in Florida, took his company public, and it was not expected. And he happened to have put stock in his kids' names, not ever intending that it would be liquid, but overnight, and this is an incredibly unusual set of circumstances, but without any idea that was going to happen, I came into $20 million, literally almost overnight.
What?
Yeah. And
Wow. Okay.
it unexpected.
Yeah.
And so but I decided that I put that all in an endowment and started Catalyst for Peace. And I just had this sense of um, I had a clear sense of what I thought was needed in the world at that time. And that now, rather than being on the grant receiving end, which is how I had always engaged in the field of peace building, was on the grant writing and grant receiving end, I could be on the granting side, and
Mhm.
say, okay, what is it that I think the world needs? How can we use these resources to help make that happen? What are the contributions that I want to make into the field? And so that was the genesis of Catalyst
Wow.
for Peace. And just to say, our focus, having gone to graduate school in international relations at the time that the Soviet Union broke apart and the Cold War ended and the Iron Curtain fell, I could
Mhm.
see this major shift in our
Mhm.
international system. But we didn't have new peace building mechanisms to accompany this
Mhm.
major change. And it felt to me increasingly wars were civil wars and impacting ordinary people.
Yeah.
And didn't have any ways of involving ordinary people in building the peace. And I thought this is a huge wasted resource. And that's what I wanted to dedicate Catalyst for Peace to really learning in what would it take to create the space for the people who were closest to the violence, closest to the conflict, to be the ones who get to lead in addressing it. And to do that within a system that's actively designed to support that. Instead of having to fight against the system and fight against the status quo, what would it mean? What are the systems that support that way of working? I was always a systems thinker. I think that's why I was a political scientist. And so I wanted to use the resources of our foundation to live my way into answering that question. And so that was kind of the question, that and how do we work in a way that brings the best of faith into the work of international
Yeah.
peace?
Let me just jump ahead here to ask you that how in the world did your organizations focus on Sierra Leone? Rather,
Yeah,
there's all kinds of things you could be doing here in the United States. There's no shortage of things you could be
yeah,
doing here. Why in the world did you say, let's go to Sierra Leone, okay?
right. Well, I say I didn't find Sierra Leone, Sierra Leone found me. And I had been doing a 2-year project actually there's a global grassroots interfaith organization called the United Religions Initiative that I worked closely with on a long-term project. It was over 2 years um, to help. They wanted to help develop the peace building capacity of their members who were all over the world, many of whom were in areas where there was significant violence and significant religiously motivated violence. And so we
Mhm.
worked with the United Religions Initiative, and then one of my most respected colleagues in the field, John Paul Lederach, to do a 2-year pilot training program of these teams from around the world. One team was from Uganda, one team was from Ethiopia, one from Southern India, one from the Philippines. Anyway, and it was this amazing work was happening in this area. And I had never worked in Africa before. And I was especially blown away by the work that was happening in northern Uganda. That was at the height of their civil war.
Mhm.
And I thought, nobody knows about this work. They're doing amazing work and nobody knows about it. And when I was in college, I had interned at Monitor Radio when Sarah Terry was there. She was a correspondent for them, a journalist who had since left the Monitor and was a documentary photographer. We reconnected.
Mhm.
She had just come back from Sierra Leone and doing work for somebody else. And she was talking about the amazing forgiveness stories that she was hearing about in Sierra Leone. I was talking about these amazing forgiveness stories in northern Uganda, and how I wanted to share them. And we decided we would put together a storytelling project to tell the stories of forgiveness and reconciliation in different post-war African settings. And so that became a project of Catalyst for Peace.
Mhm.
And as we put together that program, Sarah went back to Sierra Leone to start more systematically collecting those stories and met John Cocker, who is a Sierra Leonean human rights advocate, had been a leading human rights advocate during the war. And just a little bit about John, he would, like, as a human rights advocate, he started his own organization during the war, would disguise himself as a rebel soldier,
Mhm.
infiltrate the rebel camp, sit around the bonfire with them while they're all drawn about what they did that day, um,
Mhm.
sneak out, and this is in the days of payphones, call
Mhm.
Amnesty International or Article 19 and say, okay, this happened here, this happened here, this happened here. And that's how word got out to the world about what was happening in the Civil War in Sierra Leone. Okay, that's John Cocker.
Wow.
Then he had been an advocate for reconciliation all along and wanted the process to be led at the community level. And then he led the civil society part. Sierra Leone had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after the war. And he led that from the civil society perspective, but they weren't taking it to the community level. They weren't involving the people. And so he was so frustrated, and he felt like there would never be forgiveness in his country. And Sarah asked him, well, what would it look like? Do you think? And he spilled out this vision. It has to be at the community level, run by the
Mm,
people themselves, drawing not on Western ideas of what justice is, but on our culture and our tradition. And Sarah
mm,
just said to him, you need to meet Libby, because it was like, um, and he happened to be, and I say that with quotes because we've had serendipity after serendipity. He happened to be coming to Columbia University for a human rights fellowship 2 weeks later.
mm,
So, and I'm based in Maine. We spoke on the phone. I brought him up to Maine, and we spent the day talking and decided, okay, we need to work together to create this program that can be owned and run by the people themselves locally, drawing on your culture and your tradition. And so that was in the fall of 2007, and we decided to work together to to create the program that became Fambul Tok, which means family talk, in Creole, which is the language in Sierra Leone,
mm.
and that's their cultural tradition that they're drawing, that they decided they wanted to draw on and adapt to do.
Tell us a little about what that family talk actually means, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Because you said
So
that's so important, that's kind of key, isn't it?
it is, yeah. So they have this tradition in Sierra Leone of, first of all, just to take a step back, if I hurt you, I am hurting not only you, but your whole family. That's their
Mm,
understanding of how harm works. And family is defined not just biologically, but broadly. And conversely, we don't have justice until the community is made whole again. Justice
mm,
in that culture isn't about punishing somebody and separating them off like it is in a Western context. It's about making the community whole again. And that
mm,
includes both victim and perpetrator. And so, Fambul Talk or family talk is this tradition of coming together in the village around the bonfire as a whole community. And if there's been a wrong, acknowledging it and apologizing in
mm,
front of the community. And it's the community collectively solving its problems, basically together. And so
mm,
this was the tradition that John wanted to adapt to deal with post-war healing, because you had, uh, I mean, everybody in Sierra Leone was touched by the war, but you had people living next door to each other who I might have amputated your arm, or burned down your house, or killed your child, or forced you to kill a family member, or raped your mother in front of you, or whatever.
mm, gosh.
And we're
Mm,
living next to each other, and we've never talked about what's happened. And you can imagine
mm,
in a village like that, you can't go forward
no,
that way. And so, no matter what had
mm,
happened in the formal processes, the communities were never able to reconcile or move forward because there was never a process that invited them into doing that. And so that's the gap that Fumble Talk stepped into. Um,
yeah. I have to ask, is there a leader that leads the process, or is that, how does that work?
so the Fumble Talk process. So John Cocker is the leader of Fumble Talk organization, and the
Hmm.
way the process of Fumble Talk works, or worked, because the organization, sort of the first phase of the work for the first probably 8 years, was this real focus on community healing after the war, community reconciliation and healing.
Mm,
And it's shifted and adapted since then. But that community healing work was the way the organization works is the Fambul Tok staff doesn't go in and do this process for the communities. They facilitate the communities running the process themselves. And so what that means, Fambul Tok has a small national staff. And when they go work in a district, which is what they call
Mhm.
basically states in Sierra Leone,
Mhm. Mhm.
they recruit a team of all volunteers from that district to be the
Mhm.
volunteers to supervise the process there in their home district. They
Yeah, got it.
hire two local staff from the district to run it there because there are so many different languages being spoken. You need somebody who
Mhm.
can speak the local languages, who knows the local traditions. So they
Mhm.
have local staff and local networks of volunteers that run it locally. And then they go into the communities, have the communities identify the people that they feel are the most trusted, trustworthy, community-oriented people in their community. The staff trains them to
Mhm.
facilitate the process. Because then
Mhm.
when they then plan this bonfire ceremony, and it takes about 3 months to do that planning. But it's not because they're slow, it's because that 3 months of planning is actually reknitting the fabric of community.
Mhm.
And in a lot of ways, that is the actual healing work,
Yeah,
is reknitting the fabric of the community because they're planning it themselves.
yeah.
And it's a bonfire ceremony in their village, and it's run by them themselves. And you can't get, it's non-judicial, so you can't get um,
Mhm.
put in prison for anything that you confess
Mhm.
around the bonfire. And then after, so they have this ceremony, and then they do some sort of cleansing ceremony or traditional ceremony afterwards that's drawing on their
Mhm.
cultural tradition.
Mhm. Mhm.
Oftentimes it's the next day. They'll have a feast that night after they do the testimonies. And then the next day they'll do a cleansing ceremony. Um, and
Wow.
and that's just the beginning. I mean, it's that
Yeah.
initiates, now that the community is reknit, that initiates this process where now they plan all of these follow-up activities to cement
Yeah.
the reconciliation that's happened.
So tell us, you told me a story that when we first talked that was extremely moving about a man that had killed a family, that had killed a neighbor's family
Yeah,
member.
yeah.
Can you just tell us that story?
And I don't remember the exact one that I told you, but there's lots of one like that, and I'll tell one.
Okay, pick one. Pick
Yeah,
one.
the one that comes to my mind is actually in the village of Dabu, which was it's in the eastern part of Sierra Leone, Kailaun, right on the Liberian border. And the Kailaun is actually where the war started and where some of the most gruesome atrocities were. There was a village called Dabu that was a rebel stronghold. And what that means is that when the rebels were there in control, about half the population fled. And
Mm.
the other half that stayed, when the war was over, everybody came back. Everybody thought if you had stayed, you were a rebel or a rebel
Mm.
collaborator.
Mhm.
And so the town was kind of divided in half. But there was one woman, her name was Mariama. She and her family escaped when the
Mm.
rebels came. They buried their food, which was a common thing that people would do, or valuables, and would flee. And they all escaped except for her 7-year-old daughter. And
Mm.
Michael was among the rebels that came to that village of Dabu and captured the 7-year-old daughter. And they ordered her to tell them where they had buried the food, and she wouldn't tell them. They tied her to a chair and they beat her, and she still
Mm.
wouldn't tell. And they beat her so hard
Mm.
that she died.
Mm.
And after the war, Mariama and her family came back and lived next door to Michael
Mm.
and had never talked about what happened.
Mm.
When Dabu had its bonfire ceremony,
Mhm.
and the local chief stood up and said, "This is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. We're doing it all over the country. It's important for you to stand up, get this off your chest, apologize, acknowledge what you've done so that we can move on and move forward. And opened up the ceremony. The first person to jump up to testify around the bonfire was Michael. And Michael came up and acknowledged what he had done, um, and and apologized. And the local leader who was facilitating the ceremony said, "Is the person whose child this was here?" And Mariama stood up and came into the bonfire circle. And Michael stood and bowed
mm,
at in front of Mariama, which is the Sierra Leonean cultural symbol of apology.
mm,
Mariama touched his head, which is the symbol of forgiveness,
mm,
and forgave him.
mm,
And they stood up, linked arms, moved off, danced. The community came around and danced. I mean, at one level, like that in and of itself is extraordinary. Um, the next day, because we were filming the Fambul Tok, what became the Fambul Tok film, and this is Sarah Terry was the film director, came back and had been filming the whole process from the beginning. And so she was interviewing Michael and Mariama and asked Mariama, how could you do this? Like, and she said a couple of things, we have to forgive so that we can develop. We can't move on without the forgiveness.
mm,
And she said, I used to be carrying the weight of my daughter's death on my own. And she had her hands like this. And she said, and now the whole community is carrying it with me. And she could accept his forgiveness. I mean, his apology. She could forgive him, in other words, because she knew she was safe. The
mm,
community was going to help ensure that something like that never happened again.
mm,
And she knew that her acceptance, her forgiveness of him would help their community move forward as well as her. And indeed it did. I mean, Michael, her daughter would have been about 17 at that time. And obviously doing a lot of things around around chores around the house. Michael started doing those things, carrying water for her and for Mariama,
mm,
because
mm,
he felt an obligation to sort of replace in some way the daughter. And
mm,
they started working together on other things. The whole community came together in ways. And that was only one testimony of about 10 that night. Um, that the first time that the community members had to really acknowledge what they had done, and begin the process of moving forward.
mm.
So extraordinary.
Being a Christian Scientist, and you've now witnessed a few things that you probably wouldn't normally witness regarding these issues with people against each other in such horrendous ways. Um, what do you now think forgiveness is? I mean, what makes total forgiveness, you know, sustainable, possible?
I don't, I'm always hesitant to answer that question because what I can, I think it can be a lot of different things in different
Okay,
contexts.
okay.
How I might answer that is more some of the things that I've learned about it. And in the context in Sierra Leone, where they're recovering from a civil war, forgiveness and this process around the bonfire, it wasn't the end of the story. In a way, it's like a new beginning. And it represents a willingness and a commitment to work together going forward.
Mm,
So that's one thing. And I think in a way that takes a little bit of pressure um, off of it. The other thing is the, in that, here's an interesting thing, actually, and this is a little bit of a sideline, but it's, we made a Fumble Talk film, and it screened all over the world, and I've done lots of conversations with folks about it. And people are blown away by the stories of forgiveness. And they're like, how can they do that? How can they do that? How can they do that?
Yeah.
It's hard for the Western mind to apprehend. And I remember having the Fambul Tok staff over here for staff meetings in the US when we did a screening, and they got to come and they got to hear people's questions and, be a part of responding to them. And one of the staff was so surprised that people were surprised about forgiveness. And from his
Mm.
perspective, he was like, how could you not forgive? Like, he was
Mm.
as blown away, like, that people might not forgive as those Americans were that the Sierra Leoneans had forgiven. Like, it was just a completely different cultural orientation. How could you
Right.
not forgive? And in that
Yeah.
sense, in a subsistence living culture like in Sierra Leone, every person is needed for that community to survive. And so this concept of a whole community is in part a pretty sophisticated understanding of the way we're collective creatures, communal creatures as well as individual. It's also a survival tool. Um, and you need victims and perpetrators to be positive contributors to the society. We need each other.
Yeah.
Um, and and I think that understanding actually has informed a lot of my understanding of forgiveness. We need each other. We need
Yeah.
each other. Um, and then I'll say, because it's connected to that, the importance of the community container.
Mm.
And I'm going to just tell a story because I mentioned that I had worked in northern Uganda, and I worked there with the Acholi religious leaders. Um, and one of their founders, Bishop MacLeod Achola, um, his family, Uganda, and and um, he talked about, and he was working on a reconciliation process in northern Uganda. And he said, how do we deal with the truth? The truth is hard and it's hot. It's like fire. And if
Mm.
you hold fire in your hands, it'll burn you. So how do you deal with a truth that is that horrible, that hot, that burning, like those
Mm.
kind of deaths? And he said,
Yeah.
you need a fireproof container. And he said that he thought in northern Uganda that fireproof container was mercy. Mercy was the container that allowed you to hold the heat of truth, even really horrible truth. And I think that same thing is true in Sierra Leone. And I think they modify it a little bit because the container is also the community.
Mm.
When you have a healthy and whole community, it can hold something so much more powerful than any one individual can hold themselves. So
Mm.
Mariama can accept Michael's apology because she knows the community now is bound to help ensure that it never happens again and to help her meet her needs. And
Mm.
having witnessed so many of these incredible examples of forgiveness of some of the most heinous things, I've
Mhm.
seen the power of community to transmute. It's like an alchemical. I mean, it's a, a, a source of alchemy. Like it can take, or like mycelium almost, like it can take things that seem poisonous and transmute it into something that's actually a nutrient for the community.
Mhm.
Um, and so with like they are able as a community to hold some of even the most egregious wrongs. And so I would say forgiveness in Sierra Leone has taught me more and more about the incredible healing power of community.
That's a it's not a thought that we normally have here, but it is such a powerful
Yeah,
concept. What a spiritual idea. It can see kind of sort of like community reformation.
very
It's
much.
not it's not an individual it's a little bit like
Yeah.
how bees work, in a way. I mean, the community works they can't be an isolated bee. I mean, you
Yeah.
really can't.
Yeah.
And I can see sort of your ideas are just universal, very,
Yeah.
very beautifully universal. We could certainly use that in our criminal justice system here in the United
Yeah.
States. Um,
Yeah.
I can see we're running a little bit late here, but I do want to ask you, tell us what has transpired in Sierra Leone since your work there.
Yeah.
How is it spreading, and how are you making this thing? How are you making this larger than just yourselves?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so first of all, in this first phase of the Fambul Tok's work, where it was really fully focused on providing um, community reconciliation, um, it we Fambul Tok held across the country 250 reconciliation ceremonies, bonfire ceremonies. And at each one, there were about, on average, about 10 villages. 2,500 villages participated in a reconciliation ceremony. And so the national reach was huge. And then Ebola struck. And I don't know if you remember in 2014, 2015, there was
Yeah.
a major outbreak of Ebola in West Africa.
Yeah.
Um, and what we found, so first of all, everything like every all of the normal work had to cease. But it also, as horrific as it was, it provided an interesting opportunity because, Fambul Tok would go in and work by rebuilding the community networks. And what happened when Ebola struck was there was the response in a lot of ways perpetuated a lot of the really harmful things about the war response. And there was a massive influx of aid from the outside and very little of it going to the communities. And
Mm,
the aid that did come in there was so much distrust because of the way the aid process has worked traditionally. There was so much distrust that it made it harder to do the work. Whereas Fumble Talks, in the communities where Fumble Talk had worked and they had reknit the communities and they had these local structures that they had put in place, they were able to do Ebola prevention and they were trusted sources for doing that. And in particular, part of the Fumble Talk process had been to establish women's groups locally. They call themselves the Peace Mothers. And so the Peace Mothers led a whole Ebola prevention plan that was among the most successful approaches in Sierra Leone. Meanwhile, Fumble Talk and my organization, Catalyst for Peace, really lobbied the government to embrace a more community-centric approach to the Ebola response. Initially in preventing the spread, but then after it was over in initiating the recovery. And it was like we didn't want the same process to be repeated all over again and leave the communities in a lot of ways even worse. And so we began to argue for a completely different approach and said, this is the example, and led a national conversation on how to do that. The result was an adaptation of the process that Fumble Tok used in the communities, but instead of doing it for just post-war recovery, it's now focused on recovery from Ebola and ongoing sort of development, how the community wants to develop and address the other issues facing it. And just to quickly say, we grew that nationally and then brought the national government in who said, this is exactly how we want to be doing this. We've
mm,
been working with them. They've turned it into a national policy framework. And then we've been working with them to implement it nationally and to bring in larger funders, the World Bank and the EU and others to fund it so that it can roll out nationally. And we're still in the process of working with them on implementing that. Meanwhile, in addition to the work that Fambul Tok does in Sierra Leone, we've really, through the film that we made, a book that we wrote, then my book 3 years ago, been really leading the global conversation on how to work differently, how to work in ways that put the the people most impacted in charge, right?
Mm,
Well supported at every level. And it's what I
mm,
call, we've come to call that an inside out approach, where those most on the inside lead, well supported by those on the outside. And a
mm.
traditional aid system is outside in.
Yeah.
You and so we've been running global learning, developing a global learning and practice community and running a whole bunch of global um, uh, processes, events to just help to grow this way of working. And it's meeting a global, like there's a larger global movement that's really interested in in working differently and in working in similar ways. And so in a lot of ways it's kind of meeting the moment.
Mm. We could do this actually for a lot longer,
Yeah.
but right now we are going to turn this over to the folks that are listening to you, and they will have questions. So let's turn this over to Gabriel, and he can kind of direct that activity.
All right. Well, if anybody has a question for Libby, please raise your hand and we'll call on you. So Margie, let's start with you.
Well, this really isn't a question, but Libby, I got to see the movie. Um, well, it seems like it must be at least a decade ago, and it
Yeah.
was the most amazing thing I have ever seen. I just thought it was beautiful. And thank you for the work you're doing. And how
Mm.
exciting for your windfall. I've told my children the only reason I'd want to make more money is to have more to give away. They don't seem to
Yeah.
understand that, but oh, I can't imagine the excitement that you felt when you suddenly had a windfall and you could be the donor as opposed
Yeah.
to the requester of funds. So
Yeah.
thank you for what you're doing.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, thank you. Um, uh, I'll just say a little bit of something about that. I know you don't have a question. It sounds like I just want to make sure. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Those kind words. One of the things I made the decision when I started Catalyst for Peace in the endowment, um, not to be a perpetual endowment, meaning, the tax law in the United States makes it so that you can, as long as you give away 5% of the endowment, the endowment can continue perpetually. And I had this conviction that the generation that makes the money should see the benefit of those funds used for social good. I don't believe in perpetual endowments. And so we've had made the decision
Mm.
to spend down the endowment and sunset it over the course of a generation. We actually, just in June, spent down the endowment. So,
Nice. Karen, I see your hand is up.
Yes, you talked about how the they the they attempted to, or they successfully brought in the government, I guess you might say, to have them part of the process, and the government embraced that. And I'm wondering how the money filtered down or filtered then, since you had said when money was coming in, it wasn't really reaching the communities. How did the money get filtered down once the government had kind of embraced the project?
well, that's the part that we're still working on, in actuality. And just to say a little bit about the Fambul Tok process in general and the way what we're working with the government to implement. Fambul Tok actually doesn't give money to the communities. Or very little, in very limited ways. What they do is they bring the community together and invite the community to ask for themselves what they need, how they can work together to do it, um, and what support they might need in order to do it. And so it's not about actually giving money to the communities necessarily, but facilitating this process of repairing the community bowl. And what I mean by that is And the metaphor that I like to use is, if you think about the community as like a cup and aid as like a bottle of water. Here, I have this bottle of water. Just imagine I had a cup. And when there's a problem in the community, in this case, it could be post-war, it could be poverty, whatever, the aid community, and whether it's local or national or international, pours water in to the community to address whatever that problem is. Only it goes right through because the cup itself is cracked. And Fambul Tok's work hasn't been about pouring water in, it's about repairing the cracks in the cup so that then you can hold the water. And also then it becomes, the community itself becomes more like a well, and it can tap into the deep reserves of groundwater right there in the community when they're functioning together like that. And so Fambul Tok's work has been about repairing the cup, and the national framework that were developed is basically a process of repairing all the community cups all over the country, and the sectional and chiefdom cups and the district cups, bringing people together in collaborative processes so that they can make the decisions and that the cups are repaired. But even with that, and it's a little, I don't want to just get into too much of the complicated technical part of it. There is a huge challenge because either from the government's perspective, they think if you go down to the district level, that's going to the community, when in fact, they just don't focus local enough because it's just too complicated and too hard. Other organizations like the World Bank, they'll go in to a more local level, and they'll either just give a ton of money, but it's not about the money. Oftentimes, it sounds odd to say, it's about the process. And most aid money goes to things that are visible. I want to see a school built. I want to see a hospital built. I want to see something visible. And what it takes to repair a cup is good process. And so the challenge is in helping people understand what good process is, what's possible when you have a good facilitative process, and how to structure and support that. So it's changing a mindset that it isn't just about giving something that's visible, but about process, and supporting the good facilitative process so that people can really lead those things themselves. And you're absolutely right. And one of the challenges that we're in the middle of is the government wants to work fast, understandably so. But if you work too fast, you don't leave the community any different than, like, I always say you have to go slow to go fast. And helping to change that mindset is just, it's one of the key challenges that we're in the middle of.
Let's go to Rachel and then Denise.
Libby, thank you so much. Your talk, much of your talk brought me to tears. And I really, when I was in college at Principia, one of my very favorite classes was Religious Resources for Peace, taught by Cynthia Sampson. I loved that.
Yes.
And yeah, my heart is in this work. I love it. And that's why I majored in I was a double major of religion and world perspectives. So thank you so much for your work.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. I love that you took Cynthia's class. That's awesome.
Yeah. I don't know how many, maybe she only taught one semester.
She did. She came as a visiting professor, I want to say just for one semester. And I don't remember actually if I think she taught 2 classes when she was there.
Yeah. So
Yeah, great.
I took at least one. I think I only took one of hers, but yeah. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, you're so welcome, and thank you. Thank you for those warm, appreciative words. I'm grateful, and grateful that your heart's in it still.
Yes, very much.
You know, the heart.
I would very much like to be doing this kind of work.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well,
Thanks.
Wow.
let's move on to Denise, and then I think Margie, your hand was up, and then Melanie.
Hi, Libby. Thank you so much. It seems that you've got this really PhD, like this incredible learning in forgiveness and grace and mercy. And I think one of the things that's standing out to me right now is that in Sierra Leone, they had like an experience of like whole community and like what it was like to be in that wholeness.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you've learned about living in this country where a lot of our communities have never gotten to experience that sense of wholeness from the beginning, or like that sense of beloved community from the beginning. And so all of these like really deep and profound lessons that you've learned, how do you living in this country on this land, like how do you see community building here, that comes from just like there's just different work to do, and I'd
Yeah.
love to hear you like speak on that for a little bit.
I love that question. I think it's a great question. And part of me just wants to ask you, you see it, because I'm sure you see it in a lot of really good ways. I see, first of all, I see here that we're really hungering and thirsting for community, and which gives me a lot of hope. And I see it popping up in a lot of different ways. One of the most obvious, and I think it's an easier way, and in our work, when we were in active release of the film, we had a whole educational curriculum developed with it and worked with schools a lot. And first of all, I think some of the leading restorative justice work that's happening in the US is happening in schools because it's kind of an easy place to start at some level because it is a place where there's built-in community. Classes are like built-in communities. And we had that happen in a sixth grade class in Philadelphia that I worked with, where they just embraced these ideas and started doing their own classroom Fambul Talks when you know, they had all these conflicts in their class that were keeping them from learning. And then they started a Fambul Talk club, and then they worked with other schools in the area, right? And I think young people get it in ways, and classes are the places where there's some built-in community. So that's one place where it's happening. I think there's even things like local food movement, and in other ways that where there's a renewed attention to local, which is different than community somehow, but I think it's part of that same trend. It's one of the places where I see, like, we're trying to figure out how we build infrastructure to strengthen local connection. And that's kind of the heart of what community is. And so that's a place that may be unexpected. A lot of race and justice work, equity work. I think they're really pioneering some of the most innovative community mobilization work in this country. And I think you often see it on places that are more of the margins, quote unquote, in the society, because when you can't do things through individual effort, the only way you can is through collective and collaborative and communal. And I think we're waking up more so to the ways in which, you have to start small in order to go big, and you have to go slow in order to go fast. All of these things that are counterintuitive. Um, and uh, even things like you're seeing more renewed attention to things like mutual aid societies and mutual aid organizing. And while that's often emerged after a disaster, a renewed attention to mutual aid work, um, I think there's also more recognition of the ways in which we can more intentionally structure those kinds of things. So I see it happening in different ways, and things like um, Rebecca Solnit's book, is it Hope in the Dark, that where she talks about um, after Katrina, after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, um, and how so much of the mainstream approaches and the mainstream media actually made things harder for the recovery, but the incredible vibrancy of the mutual aid and community networks that came up were creative, imaginative, effective, and sort of, led to some element, even amid all the tragedy, of a thriving of a new kind of approach. But it's like we often have to work against not only the incredible individualization that we have in this culture, but also systems that make it harder rather than make it easier. So I think it's a great question. I mean, we could talk about it a lot, and my guess is there's probably a lot of people on this call that have some experience with local organizing. Um, it would be a great sort of ethnographic study to look at where are the trends? How are we as a society learning about the collective and communal, like across the country? I would love to, um, in a lot of ways, learn more about that
Thank you.
myself. Anyway, yeah. Thanks for the
All
question.
right, let's go to Melanie.
Oh, I just had a quick question. Can you tell us what years you were in Sierra Leone or?
I started working there in 2007. And that's when we created Fambul Tok. And I'm still in partnership. Fambul Tok is still in existence, and we still work in partnership with them.
Do
Have
you,
you been to Sierra Leone? Have you spent time there?
well, my father did a lot of aid work there earlier than 2007. I think he was there in 1968,
Oh, gosh.
on and off temporary duty TDY 68 to 70. Um, in 72, he was assigned to Cote d'Ivoire. So then we all lived there. But he was with USAID, and I think I I applaud your work, especially with these inter family wars and stuff. It's crazy, and I know that a lot of that went on after we left Cote d'Ivoire because the president
Yeah.
Houphouët Boigny, was out of his mind, and so he, at the end of his life, because he was president for life, he siphoned all the money of the country into this basilica the size of St. Peter's in Yamoussoukro, which was like nowhere, and he, declared that that was the capital. So of course there was, uprising and so forth because all the money was gone. But I felt like when we were there, the work, was really great and the people were very receptive. It was more like Jesus work. It was like my dad would go out, find out what people needed, and then
Yeah.
teach them how to do their own stuff, their own, you know, watering systems, irrigation, et cetera, building schools, building wells, like you were talking about. So it wasn't the personal, the interpersonal, but
Yeah.
I felt like there was a lot of give and take, and it was a very nice community. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your
That's a
talk.
great experience for you to go out. Yeah, you're so welcome.
Do we have any other folks who would like to ask a question or follow up on any of the ideas? So we have a few things in the chat.
I just want to say this to Libby. First, thank you for taking the time out of your very, very busy schedule to be with us here. And I love the idea that forgiveness is the first step. And it sort of reminds me that repentance is the first step. and it leads to reformation.
Yeah.
So thanks for bringing that out. I think that was really, sometimes we think, well, kind of like forgiveness is like at the end of the line. I loved your idea that no, that's the first thing you need to do in order for anything else to actually heal or become whole. So thank you for bringing that out. That's great.
I would love to, what you're sparking for me, in reflecting that back, David, is, when I remember when I first started doing this work, a good friend who was a Christian Science practitioner and teacher, at the time said, you know, if you're doing forgiveness work, you're going to have to learn about it yourself.
Mhm.
And sure enough, that became really quite true. And, we had, over the course of doing this work, major challenges on different ones that were a threat to the work, to us as a whole organizationally, to me individually. And, I had to learn a lot about forgiveness myself in order to do in order to continue to engage this work. And in a way, what that and other things have taught me is the importance of, I think so many of us have a huge heart for humanity and a desire to really help people. And I think it's a beautiful impulse. And we define it in ways where it's about helping those people over there. And one of the things that I've learned, and I think it's especially true, and I've learned this especially since part of my role has been as a funder, the way this work gets funded, oftentimes internationally, globally, humanitarian aid in general, is we're going to fund and support those people over there, and we're the ones with the resources in there. And it's a fundamental misframing of the system that separates those with the answers and those with the needs. And I have really learned that I have to build in intentionally my own learning as much as strong as my desire to help others is. Ultimately, I can only keep doing that to the degree that I'm willing to continue to learn and grow myself, and in a way, often to be helped. And what that means for me is I have to be willing to grow to the edge of where I can no longer do it on my own, but have to be helped by others. I have to bring that vulnerability, that humility forward in a way, and to be willing to receive the gifts of others. Because I think that's what gives us, like, we can only, so I think learning how to name our own, what it is we want to learn, both in an intellectual way and in an inner way, how we want to grow, and build in structures that can support that, whether it's a regular conversation with somebody who's a trusted friend about that, or naming it and checking back in with those goals. However we do it, we have to be engaging in whatever humanitarian work we're doing, I think, in ways where we're as explicit and committed to our own deep growth as we want to foster for others. And you had asked me, David, about transformation. I think that's actually the key to transformation. We're never transforming others out there. We're part of a system of transformation. And I think we can only help others to the degree that we're willing to be a part of that transformation ourselves. And that takes intentionality, it takes work, it takes support, it takes community like this community that you're building here. How do we support each other in the learn? How do we be honest about the learning that we have to do? How do we build in structures of support for it? And really take it on, not as tangential to the work, but as part of it.
There's something that I just saw in miscellaneous writings that I had read it a million times and never saw it. You kind of have that happen. And where she says that without a knowledge of his sins and a repentance so severe that it destroys them, No person is or can be a Christian Scientist.
Mm.
I mean, that was like a thud when I read that. It's like, that's the start. That's the start of the work for all of us, really. But anyway, I
Yeah.
wanted to thank you for for producing an awful lot of thought here. This has been terrific.
Yeah, well, thank you for hosting it, for bringing the group together, and yeah, giving me the chance to share. I always love the chance to do that. So
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Can you tell us about the conference tomorrow?
Yeah, thank you. By a group of organizations here. It's being hosted at Howard University it's on U.S. African relationships. And the theme is moving from aid to agency. So looking at more generally how the U.S. Africa relationship is changing, needs to change, and in particular with the U.S. U.S. government backing out of a lot of the traditional aid roles that it's taken.
Mhm.
So that's tomorrow's conference.
Glad you're there.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Libby, for being here tonight. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in and for your good questions and comments. Once again, our next Zoom meeting will be an Angel Team meeting on Thursday, the 18th of September, and everybody here is welcome to join. And with that, why don't we wrap it up, and a big round of applause to Libby, and thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.